Why do they hate us? That question was a common refrain that Americans asked and heard quite often after September 11th, 2001. It was kind of a rhetorical artifact of a time when emotions were very raw. Today, on the cover of Foreign Policy magazine, that same question is being asked by our guest, Egyptian-American writer Mona Eltahawy. But instead of wondering whether they hate us for our freedom, her new and very provocative article directs the question, why do they hate us, at men in the Muslim world, and at the misogyny she says is so systemic in the cultures in that region. With whatever freedoms have been won in Arab Spring uprisings, it's important to ask how many have been gained for women in the region. And Mona addressed that dilemma right off the top of her piece, writing, quote, when more than 90% of ever married women in Egypt, including my mother and all but one of her 6 sisters, have had her genitals cut in the name of modesty, when Egyptian women are subjected to humiliating virginity tests merely for speaking out, it's no time for silence. Back with me is Mona Eltahawy, columnist and author of that Foreign Policy magazine cover story. Mona, this article is quite a lightning rod. So for those who have not had an opportunity to read it, just review for me briefly what your argument is in the piece.
My argument is very simply, in Egypt, we removed Hosni Mubarak, the president that oppressed us for 30 years. What I want to see happen as an Egyptian who loves my country dearly is for us to remove the Mubarak in our mind, the Mubarak in our bedroom, and the Mubarak in our street. Mubarak oppressed all Egyptians, but Egyptian society oppresses women. There is a hierarchy of oppression here, and I'm talking that oppression is misogyny. So I'm saying that the revolution that began with a man in Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire, will be completed by women, because women in the Arab world do have agency because they've gone out to the revolutions, have taken part in them, have suffered and paid a huge price for them, and they continue to fuel those revolutions. We, the women, will complete those revolutions through that revolution of the mind that removes the misogyny, that is the Mubarak in our mind.
And when you talk about misogyny, I mean, this piece is, I mean, it grabs any reader in the gut, because it's not just about, you know, are we nice to women, or do we say mean things to women, or are there pressures around women? You list a set of structural atrocities facing women in this region. Talk to me a bit about those.
I talk about a provision in the Egyptian law that says if a husband beats his wife with so-called good intentions, he will get a reduced sentence. I talk about child marriage in Yemen, which often gets support, unfortunately gets support by some clerics who say that they can give it religious justification. The day that my article came out, and some people got so upset, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia said 10-year-old girls are ready for marriage. That is outrageous. As an Arab and Muslim woman, that is outrageous to me, and it's outrageous to many people in that part of the world. Now, I recognize that that makes us look bad, but that's the whole point. It's not me that makes us look bad, it's those atrocities that make us look bad. And as a writer, it's my job to poke the painful places. Melissa, this essay is the first essay I wrote with all 10 fingers, because Egyptian riot police broke my arms and sexually assaulted me. So I speak from experience, but also with facts and statistics. And I know that the people on the ground are fighting this. Some people have said, you've said Arab women don't have agency. Quite the contrary. I listed activists who fight against the military injustice. I list activists who fight against those clerics who say girls are ready to get married. But I sent out this call because this is a time of great excitement. If we do not have this revolution of the mind now that ends the misogyny, the political revolution will fail.
Now, so this challenge that you're laying out to me as we're talking is one that feels familiar to some Western civil rights movements as well. So I start with a little bit of trepidation in this conversation, in part because I know that some of the critiques of this is the very idea that Western press, that those who are not from these nations, who are not Muslim ourselves, who are not part of these traditions, can look at your article and say, ugh, look at how horrible those men or those societies or that religion is. And it's something, you know, it's part of why, for example, we have an underreporting of rape and domestic violence in African American communities, because we know the violence enacted on black men by police, so we often don't call, right? Absolutely. So how to balance that challenge of a recognition of how the Western view, which has often been a real war, right? So that war on terrorism, that's a real war that has actively killed people in these communities, in these cities, in these nations, over and against the concern about women. how to manage that.
You described that beautifully. You know, as an Arab and as a Muslim and as a feminist, all of these identities that I balance, and as an Egyptian and as an American, for me, gender trumps everything. I will not be made to choose between all of those things and have my gender lose. When Alice Walker wrote The Color Purple, there was outrage in the African American community.
Indeed.
Because you made us look bad. So this idea of making us look bad, I understand. Because yes, there is Islamophobia. Yes, there is anti-Arab discrimination. That's not the point of my essay, though. The point of my essay is, can we for once focus on my part of the world and talk about what's really happening? Because I end my essay by saying this. I don't say come and invade us and rescue us. We don't need to be rescued.
Right.
Women are on the street getting their arms broken, fighting alongside men. I say, you, the outside world, when you come and discuss and talk with our governments, they will tell you, this is our culture, mind your own business. And I tell you, this culture was not made by women. Don't fall victim to cultural relativism, because, you know, last time I was on your show, I talked about the Republican-led war on women. I described Rick Santorum as the American Salafi, right?
Yes, indeed.
In my essay, I talk about the Salafis in the Middle East. Of course, there is patriarchy all over the world. Of course, there are problems with sexual assaults and violence against women.
Right.
We talked about VAWA just a few minutes ago.
Right. I mean, some of what you talk about occurs certainly in a very different way here. But we've been talking about, for example, on this show just last week, we spoke with a Marine who is a woman who is facing the issue of rape in our armed services. And so, you know, in part, as I read the atrocities, they both feel horrifying, but also more familiar than I think we're often honest with ourselves about.
Exactly. So there is a time to make the connections, and there's a time to say, look, I really need to focus on my community now, because it's when it begins by poking the painful places. And people go, you make us look bad. But when the finishes, we can actually sit down and work on these issues. There are tremendous activists in the region working on those issues, but we need to do so much more. Here in the US, we have a Violence Against Women Act. We're working to make it even better, to include even more people. In Egypt, we need a Violence Against Women Act. That's the difference.
Yeah.
And so I'm having this conversation in an internet age where there's no such thing now as you published it in America. Are you kidding me? Yeah. It's not on the American newsstands, and everyone in the Middle East is talking about it. And it delights me. I have received so much support, which honestly I wasn't expecting. Yeah. I'm very, very happy with the support I got. I expected the criticism, but this is how we get beyond the painful places.
Mona, I so appreciate that you want to engage in a conversation around this, and so we are going to bring in another voice in our next block. We're going to stay on exactly this issue of the issue of this particular war on women. And up next, we're going to dive into the controversy sparked by Mona's piece, and we'll add a dissenting voice to the conversation. Stay right there. We've been talking about Egyptian-American journalist Mona Eltahawy's new, powerful cover story in Foreign Policy magazine, Why Do They Hate Us?, which gives a stark look at the misogyny and repression women in the Middle East continue to endure. But as soon as the article was posted, Mona faced intense pushback and criticism, particularly from Muslim women. Joining us again is Mona Eltahawy, and from Boston, one of those critics, Leila Ahmed, professor of divinity at Harvard and author, recently, of A Quiet Revolution, the Veil's Resurgence from the Middle East to America. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Oh, I'm so honored to be on your program, Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you. So, of course, as you know, Mona's piece touched off quite a firestorm, and I found your response to be particularly thoughtful and careful. So can you just sort of run through for us a bit about what your critique is?
Okay, well, I think I'd like to actually take up the point that you began with earlier about how wars are real things rather than metaphors, and I think that's a very important point. So when I was title of War on Women, I would really, there are people who are actually dying from bombs. And you also talked earlier about the politics of the representation of Muslims and Arabs, and I think that's very important too. But before I go on, let me also make my point about my disagreement with one. I'd first of all like to salute her and thank her for the extraordinary work she's doing, and to really give her my respect and admiration for, and my apologies for, and how sorry I am that what happened to her happened, the suffering that she was subjected to. And really I thank her for her work, and my disagreements with her in no way take away from that. She is a hero to me. So now on the points on the essay, I have some broad problems with her generalizations, but beyond that, I I think, a core disagreement. So let me just give you a sense of the broad generalizations. For example, she talks about the Arab world from Saudi Arabia to Morocco as if there isn't vast differences between them. And just two examples. Saudi Arabia, women's ban on driving, and she's horrified in that and rages against it. And so do we all. And in fact, it's completely irrelevant to the rest of the Arab world. Women have been driving everywhere else, as far as I know, since the arrival of the car. So that's one kind of broadness that kind of muddies the waters, broad overgeneralization. Then the other, the clitoridectomy as an Arab custom. Clitoridectomy is actually an African custom, not an Arab custom. The country in which it's most commonly practiced is Egypt, which is of course African, and it's practiced by Muslims and Christians. So these broad generalizations, I think, are troubling, and I'm not going to go through the entire article.
I want to come in here for just a moment and bring Mona in for just a second, because as an academic I love nuance, but I also as a media personality know that sometimes it is just the straightforward, sometimes very loud voice that gets it heard. So what I hear the professor saying is in part, look, there are nuances here that you didn't capture, but I also wonder if with Why Do They Hate Us, you actually do capture something else.
Right. No, I wanted to go straight for the gut, but before I start, I also want to salute Professor Ahmed, because she's one of my heroes. When I was in my early 20s and struggling with a headscarf, I wore a headscarf for 9 years. I was overwhelmed with guilt, and in reading her work, especially Islam and Gender, reading her work really saved my mind, literally, because her work has been groundbreaking in feminism. So she is one of my heroes. And so now to find myself with one of my heroes on your show, having a civil disagreement is great, because it means I've grown up.
Yes, right.
But no. What I'm trying to do is go straight for the jugular. I'm like shaking people into having a discussion, which I love, as I said. But of course, there's nuance. I mean, I mentioned Saudi Arabia for the car and child marriage, but I mentioned Morocco for something else and Egypt for something else. And I give statistics and facts from each country to give as quick a picture as I can. But I can only handle so much. I think what the issue I want to discuss is the misogyny, which plays out in different ways, but ultimately it's a mix of religion, culture, and law in these various countries. What are we going to do about that? At a time of revolution, when everything is in flux, let's jump in and do this gender revolution.
Yes, Professor, yes.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment just on that, but I do have another point I want to go to, but just on these comments. And you began, Melissa, with noting how in African-American communities some things are not publicized precisely because of the racism, that's the fear of racism. And I think I would, Mona, I appreciate what you do. I would love it if you would just, I understand that you want to get your message across. It's an important message to get across. But if possible, nuances so as not to give fodder to people who simply hate Arabs and Muslims in this climate of our day. So I think these are very important points, but don't elude things that are worth noting, that are important. So, but let me go to the key difference between us, I think, which is that, Mona, you see the glass as half empty, and more than half empty. I see it as half full. And the key difference between us is that you are focusing on Islamists, Salafists, Muslim brothers, and these are there, it is true, but I'm focusing up the extraordinary people who brought down tyranny, regimes, absolutely dictatorial regimes. These are young people who believe in justice, who believe in liberty, who believe in free speech, and who are out in the square risking their lives, and some of them lost their lives. Young people just like you, by the way, and they are there, and my faith is in them. Now, it is true that the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafists, all of those people who, by the way, let's emphasize, did not bring about the revolution, did not bring down the regime. They just make profiting it by right now. It was not they who brought about this achieved the impossible, which the young people of Egypt did. And I see both men and women participating in this fight. I don't see young men hating young women. I think they are out for justice too, justice for the wives, sisters, mothers. I think we do have a new generation, and my trust is in them.
You bring up an interesting point, this question of patriarchy and misogyny as a system versus men hating women in this sort of, individual way. And that did seem to be some of the anxiety that some of your critics were suggesting as well.
Right, but to go into that, I mean, Professor Ahmed thinks that I focus just on Islamists. I don't, because that law in Egypt, for example, on domestic violence was put in place under the various dictators that we've lived under in Egypt, not the Islamists. So it's not about the Islamists. I focus occasionally on the Islamists because they do dominate, for example, the Egyptian parliament. But a lot of these countries are still living under dictatorships, and it's supposedly secular dictators who have put into place very misogynistic laws. So this is a structural problem. And I don't go around, some people have written to me and said, Mona, my father loves me. And some men have written to me and said, Mona, I love my wife. Oh, come on, I know you love your wife. I'm not talking about individuals hating each other. I'm talking about a system of patriarchy and misogyny. Well, that's where the hate comes from.
Well, that said, Professor, part of what I loved about your response to Mona's piece was that, Mona, your piece begins with a piece of fiction. It begins with a novel, which is, in fact, an interaction between a husband and wife. And so I think that that's part, I mean, it both is very compelling because it draws us in, but it also feels a little bit like it sets up that husband-wife moment. And Professor, you had a bit of a different reading on kind of the ecstatic passion of Muslim prayer and its connection with the sort of relationship that was being presented in this particular piece of fiction.
Yes, well, I mean, I just happen to have both know the story and to have met the author who, after this very unsatisfactory sexual relation with her husband, gets up and prays. And I think Mona had interpreted this as an example of sublimation through prayer or through religion, whereas I remember that the author, Alifa Rifat, said to me how she lives for prayer because it's moments of joy for her. So this is not about someone seeing religion as a kind of irrelevancy to life or a sublimation, but as a central piece of her life. And I wanted to bring that into the conversation.
Mona, you want to?
I never made the point that it was the irrelevance of religion. My point was that the sexual frustration this wife experienced, she then poured into religion. I also met Alifa Rifat, the author that we're both talking about. She was an amazing woman. She had never traveled outside of Egypt. She spoke only Arabic. But what is amazing about her is that she lived with very ordinary women across different parts of Egypt. And I interviewed her extensively. And she told me that what she was doing through her short stories, these were short stories, was getting the voices of these women across. And I think, something that has disturbed me from a lot of critiques that have come my way is that it's been women who are cushioned with privilege telling me that it's not as bad as you make it seem. And I'm saying I also have layers of privilege, which I'm very thankful for, but I'm talking about the women that don't have that privilege. For example, a banker who lives in London critiqued my piece because she said it's more complicated. Of course, for you as a banker in London, it's complicated, but not for a woman who lives in southern Egypt or southern Sudan.
Professor, yes, let's also.
Can I just give you an example of some of the complications?
Sure,
for example, Bouaziz, the young man in Tunisia who set fire to himself in an act of suicide and ignited actually the Arab Revolution. Young man, not a woman, a young man, a poor young man of the men and women who are oppressed in those societies. And he was, how did this suicide come about? He was ordered by the authorities to stop. He had a cart on which he was selling things, trying to make a living for his family. He was ordered by the authorities to stop doing that. And who was the authority? Was a police woman who then slapped his face, spat at him, and overturned his cart. So here is, how do you read this in terms of gender? Is it only women who are oppressed? I think we have an underclass of men and women, not an underclass, a majority of people who are living very tough lives, and I don't believe they're against women. We have some dreadful, powerful people who have who have power in their hands in one way or another at the moment, and who are trying to seize power after the revolution brought about by young people who didn't want this stuff, and they are trying to put their views into it. But the majority of people, I believe, the young people who brought about the revolution, are not for this awful stuff.
Professor Ahmed, I'm going to give Mona just the very last 10 seconds on this.
Absolutely, the dictatorships oppress everyone. But my concern and the reason for my outrage in this essay is that after that oppression, there is a societal oppression of women that is fueled by misogyny. This is why I wanted to have this conversation. And I'm so glad that I'm in discussion with, as I said, one of my heroes, and that so many people are talking about this, because this is the way we push beyond the painful places.
Thank you.
A pleasure, Mona. Pleasure. Thank you, Mona.
It was a pleasure to have both of you on, and thank you for joining me. This is a incredibly, critically important conversation to have. So thank you to Professor Leila Ahmed, and thank you to Mona Eltahawy, who is staying with us.